humanism is another key word that you need to know for the Renaissance. This is not humanism as we might understand it today, but rather humanism is the main cultural core for transmitting the Renaissance. It's what turns it into a pan-European elite phenomenon. So humanism is the return to the writings of the ancient world, going back to the classical revival, basically. It's therefore the thing that links politics with the intellectual developments, with literary and artistic developments. So it's probably the most studied aspect of the Renaissance. A lot of people see it as sort of heralding the beginning of modern science, modern intellectual developments. So humanism is a resurgence in the study of classical thought. That's what it means. And this includes renewed interest in the likes of Plato, continued interest in Aristotle, because as we know that there was an interest in Aristotle in the Middle Ages. So the kind of things that they adapted from going back to the classical authors, they adapted it to their time period. So this includes Plato, where they looked at human reason and the ability of human reason to understand God and the immortality of the soul. So they use this as a basis for developing religious humanism. Plato could therefore be combined with religious aspects just the way they had done with Aristotle back in the Middle Ages. In terms of Aristotle, though, they weren't as interested in what they were doing in the Middle Ages with linking Aristotle to religious thought. So they were actually emphasizing more the division in Aristotle between reason and faith. So this is in the time period where we find the splitting of theology and philosophy. When we looked at medieval universities the other week, we saw that they were pretty much viewed as one and the same. It's in the Renaissance that philosophy is treated as a different pursuit and study from theology. But this is not to say that people are any less religious, you know. Mysticism definitely gains ground in the Renaissance. This is the sort of beliefs in astrology, signs, symbols. All of this is still there in the Renaissance. Now, humanism had a really big role to play in education. As we saw, the medieval university was dominated by scholasticism. Remember that way of thinking that used logic to find compromise solutions. Well, it's a bit different in the Renaissance. They were studying the classics. I mean, both university systems studied the classics, but in the Middle Ages, they were using a Christian agenda. Francis Petrarch is the father of the humanist or Renaissance education, and he condemned scholasticism. So it was a terrible way to teach people how to think. Humanists instead focused on grammar and rhetoric, and they were focused on the political ends of this, so public letters, speeches. The aim of a humanist education was to achieve eloquence through study of the classics. So Cicero was one of the most popular classical writers to study for this reason. They called for educational reform, the abandonment of the old teaching methods, but they still used Latin. They had more books because we're in the printing era. My merging of era and area. Printing era, they still had to use textbooks. But as well as a classical education, it formed an intellectual elite and a moral elite. The things that they focused on that were new additions to education included public speaking. The Jesuits from the 1560s had their students act in plays as a way to get them confident to speak in public. They had to practice the art of discussion. Also part of a humanist education were weapons handling, dancing, things that were going to make them well-rounded in their society. Female schooling also increased at this time, but it was still only noble women who will have been educated. They'll have only been taught for a few hours a day. Women would have been taught Latin, as well as embroidery, sewing, spinning. There's still a lot of religious instruction for both men and women. Like in the Middle Ages, people were taught to read before they were taught to write. In the early 15th century, they started to open humanist secondary schools in Italy. And this established humanist studies among the Italian elites, and this meant that their courts were centres of humanist activity. So they were trying to educate the children of the elites and sort of get humanist ideas in from the ground up. It also ended up, people are competitive throughout their history. So Italian city-states actively competed with one another for the best humanist scholars, because the ruling class were competitive then, as they always are. Since the education was not as controlled by the church in Italy, in these city-states, it was able to make these educational reforms and have these humanist schools. So this has led some scholars to say that this was an educational revolution in Italy. Another thing they didn't do was the rote memorization that they had to do in medieval schools. They required students to understand and interpret what they learned. Students were, instead of just being taught to memorize, they were encouraged to compose original pieces, still in Latin, of course. So it's still very like the medieval system that it's Latin, and it pays close attention to grammar. So these schools, education allowed humanist ideals to be transmitted, as did, remember, the printing press came around in the middle of the 15th century. So this brought humanist ideas directly to educated readers who could now afford to buy books. So this is in one way that humanism was totally across Europe in its nature, with the elites, that anybody who could buy a book could read about humanism in their own time. What is debated, though, is when they look at the best-selling books list from this time period. People are like, oh, people were so influenced right across Europe by humanism because they were able to buy printed books. Well, when you look at the printing lists, it's mainly Bibles and romances that are at the top of the charts, but certainly humanism had an impact because it was now able to reach more people than it would have been able to in the Middle Ages. Humanists also had an impact on the study of history. Because it involved the study of grammar, rhetoric, it led to advances in other fields, and historical writing is one of these. The Renaissance scholars were also really interested in studying different languages. Of course, Latin was at the centre. One of their things that they were really keen on were rediscovering what they called the lost classical texts. So what they did was go around monasteries and libraries throughout Europe and some sort of like competitive intellectual treasure hunting, where they were going around the libraries looking for undiscovered classical texts that they could then write on and be the first to do it. It's pretty competitive. The study of how classical authors back in Rome and Greece, they wrote histories, led to the humanists in Renaissance Europe also wanting to write history. So medieval historians, when they wrote about history, and they didn't that much, they divided according to Christianity, Christian periods. Whereas the humanists did what we do today. They copied the way the classical historians did it, and they separated human history into years. They divided by year. Like the classical authors, they were also pretty obsessed with writing about war. There's another overlap with politics. And they did see history as a moral thing, giving practical lessons to life. And we saw how Machiavelli also believed that history was important for understanding the world around you. Another thing that they tended to write and publish about a lot were histories of their native states, their regions, their cities. Again, Machiavelli wrote a popular history of Florence. He practiced what he preached. Okay, so we're going to end here. This is our last video. You now have some exploration to do of the Uffizi Gallery, thanks to Google. And then you've got the worksheet comparing the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You'll have got plenty from these videos to help you fill that out. And that worksheet is over on Moodle for you.